Hello, Friday. Opening snip there is the Queen of England inspecting her gold. It must be her gold because it's in the Bank of England and she is the Queen of England, so it must be hers. Or not. Anyway, on that particular subject and gold, and let's go over the Atlantic to the Fed. There's a blog I've just started reading called Moneyness, which is very good. He seems one bright dude. Anyway, I'll read these 3 paragraphs to you. It's about the Fed's gold. One of them, this is from high up in the article, but there's more if you follow the link, of course. One of the more archaic features of the US monetary system is that the price of gold continues to be set at $4.22. Ever wondered why that is? This post will work through some monetary history to show why, unlike most countries, the US doesn't mark the gold price to the market price of around $1,750 or so. I'll give a quick hint. Marking the gold price to market wouldn't be a mere cosmetic change. Rather, it would require the Federal Reserve to hand over hundreds of billions of free money to the president. Here's how it all works. The Fed currently holds 261 million ounces of gold. At the archaic price of $42 an ounce, this stash is valued at a mere $11 billion. With gold today trading at about $17.50, the market value is about 261 million ounces, is about, well, just under $500 billion. Doesn't that mean that the Fed would show a huge markup if it marked to market at the gold at its real value? No. If you read the fine print, the Fed doesn't actually own gold ounces. Rather, it owns gold certificates that have been issued to it by the Treasury. There's a long history behind this. At the end of 1933, the Fed owned some 195 million ounces comprised entirely of physical gold, valued at the then official price of $20 some. The stash would have been worth $4 billion. The Gold Reserve Act, passed on January 30, 1934, required the Fed to transfer all of this gold to the Treasury, and the Treasury in return gave it $4 billion worth of gold certificates. Now, we're going to go on a bit. Cut out a chunk and I'll go to 3 more paragraphs. So let's zoom forward in time. The US revalued gold from $35 to $38 in 1972, and again in February 1973 up to the now $42.22. Just as in 1934, the benefits of modern revaluation would accrue entirely to the Treasury. At the official price of $42.22, the Fed's $11 billion worth of gold certificates currently lay claim to. You can't claim, you might pick up on it. The Fed's $11 billion worth of gold certificates currently lay claim to 261 million ounces of gold. That's $11 billion divided by 42.22. Say the official gold price was increased to $1,750, today's price. The Fed certificates would still be worth $11 billion in gold, that because they're certificates with a dollar price. So you've got $11 billion of gold certificates, but these certificates would now represent a claim on only a measly 6.3 million ounces of gold, far less than the current 261 million ounces. Do you see? You've got the value, the dollar value from that initial 4 billion, and you can only buy that much gold back with those certificates, those gold certificates. That's what the Fed's got. So it can't buy the gold back. It can only buy the gold back really at the 1933 price, which is not advantageous. After our hypothetical revaluation, around 255 million ounces, that's the 261 total, less the 6.3 that it can buy, sitting in the Treasury vaults would be free and unencumbered. But the Treasury might choose to just sit on this new treasure trove, but most likely it would proceed directly to the Fed without passing go, deposit $450 billion, just under $500 billion's worth of gold certificates, 250 million ounces at $17.50, and receive in return a massive $450 billion stash of Federal Reserve notes or deposits dollars. And you can go on to read more of the intricacies if you follow the link. Quite amusing all round. Yeah, this is a big jump and there's no connection. But I keep tabs open. When I see something interesting, I just throw it into tabs in Firefox, and I've got Econ 1, Econ 2, Econ 3 energy tabs open in Firefox. And I go through them to see what I can link together to make a presentation. And Ireland always gets in there, but it just seems to be disconnected, and Ireland never seems to get in. So disconnectedly, I'm going to put Ireland in here. And just before that, I'll note that Axel it is that's saying that Japan's going to strip mine the moon. And I say, well, before technology gets to strip mining the moon, it'll have to sort something about Adobe Flash Player, which on my Firefox crashes it 3 or 4 times a day. If they can't get something more solid than Adobe Flash Player, I don't think there's going to be any strip mining on the moon. But that's another subject. Okay, Ireland imposes 6th straight austerity budget. I'll go straight to the bottom because we know what an austerity budget is. He said Ireland expects report deficits of 8.2% this year and 7.5% the next. 6 years of, or 6 straight austerity budgets, and they're still running deficits of 7 and 8%. Still a long way to go in Ireland, and things, they're really doing well, but shows what hell you get when the government accepts on the people's behalf to bail out the banks, basically. And this one is from the Irish Economy blog, and it's basically saying that mortgage defaults are going up again in Ireland. Basically, reports of Ireland doing well are correct in their own way, but they've got to be balanced against many other things, and Ireland is in terrible trouble, and we shouldn't forget it or them. Right, the Fed and what was said in the last open mouth committee meeting, etc., and the talking to the media afterwards, it's really been quite a big change that the Fed now is talking about. Well, I'll read through this, and you will have heard it all, but I just want to register that OTP, sees what the Fed is doing, and in a way, I'm quite strange that it hasn't affected more things. It seems to have just passed off as, oh, that's just another thing the Fed's doing, but it really is quite a big step that the Fed has taken. Anyway, I forget what blog or newspaper this is from. The Fed has announced for the first time what levels of unemployment and inflation would lead to its short-term interest rates close to zero. Because the Fed, everyone says the rate it is has been aiming at for the inflation rate is 2%, but it's never said that. It's just been presumed. Anyway, this is Bernanke speaking, isn't it? In particular, the committee decided to keep the target range for the federal funds rate to 0 to 0.25%, and currently anticipates this exceptionally low range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate for at least as long as the unemployment rate remains above 6.5%. Inflation between 1 and 2 years ahead has projected to be no more than 0.5 percentage point above the committee's 2% longer run goal, and longer term inflation expectations continue to be well anchored. There's a lot in there. The blog tries to unwrap some of it, but okay, I'll go straight into the next paragraph. There are several remarkable aspects to this sentence. First, the Fed is saying more clearly than ever before that 2% is the long-range inflation target. Second, it is saying that it thinks the unemployment rate can be brought down at least as far as 6.5% without causing too much inflation, though it will keep a close watch on where inflation seems to be headed to make sure. Third, the Fed is saying that it is willing to tolerate inflation temporarily above 2% if that is what it takes to bring the unemployment rate down. And another thing to note, which is quite an important thing, even if the employment rate comes down below 6.5%, the Fed has said that does not automatically mean that we stop our clever business. It can go down to 6%, but doesn't actually automatically mean we stop. We will take special note at 6.5%. But I'll note there's an awful long way between, what are we now, 7.7 and 6.5. There's a long way between there. And even not brought out there, they're still projecting this to go on for an awful, awful long time. Right. Finish with this from Warren Mosler's blog, who picked up on Richard Koo's latest report, firing out through Nomura, who he works for. And I find this quite interesting, bordering on the very, very interesting, because Koo's writing this. But nightmare scenario awaits when private loan demand recovers. This is the banking system. The problem is what happens when private loan demand recovers. Loan books could grow more than tenfold, this is the fractional reserve banking type thing, in the US and fivefold in Japan and Europe if bank reserves remain at current levels, triggering inflation rates of 500% to over 1,000%. To avoid this outcome, central banks will have to mop up excessive reserves by raising the statutory reserve ratio, which they don't normally play with in Europe and America, raising the interest rate paid on reserves, and selling government bonds. This is the getting out of the hole that they're in. All of these measures will serve to lift interest rates, sending bond yields sharply higher and triggering a possible crash in the bond markets. This is Richard Koo speaking. A sharp increase in government bond yields would lead to fiscal collapse in countries with large national debt. For Japan, where the national debt amounts to 240% of GDP, the result would be catastrophic. And I'll repeat again, this is Richard Koo speaking. I haven't been able to find the Nomura report that this is in, but Warren Mosler's picked up on it, and I've got to trust Warren Mosler, because in most all occasions I trust Warren Mosler. I don't know what to make of this. The best that the Mystic Mind has come with is, I'm glad. You get people like, I don't know, Peter Schiff. He made a good call on the US housing. But when you make a good call, Steve Keen made a good call on US housing. It absolutely does not mean that you'll make a good call next call and the call afterwards. It does not mean it. You can tend to think, well, if they got that right, they'll get something else right. But it doesn't mean that at all. Richard Koo, now we've got to think, my mind says he's more likely now to be right on what he's talking about the balance sheet recession, because he's so horrendously wrong here. And he's worked for the Fed, and he works for a big investment bank, or stroke normal bank, Nomura, a huge outfit in Japan, and has done for a long time. He, if anybody, is best placed to know these things. So it's all a bit of a bother. But for the moment, I'm establishing that people that sometimes make brilliant calls, their brilliant calls are kind of followed by absolutely sod-awful calls afterwards. and I think this does turn out to be Richard Koo speaking, is making one great stupid boo-boo here. Right, leave you with it. Well, why? This is classic fractional reserve banking. He's going against what, let's say, Steve Keen says, or what I've struggled for many months to try and explain to everybody. All Koo is doing here is saying the banks have this much reserves and they're not lending because the people aren't worth lending to. But if the banks think they are worth lending to, they can lend out 10 times the amount of their reserves. He works for a bank, but he does not know how banks work. Banks do not lend out their reserves, or at least don't need to lend out their reserves. They just lend out fountain pen money, and then they can use their reserves or deposits to back them. He's just basically going back to 1950 type, going back to his college days about what he learnt about how banking works. He hasn't gone down the corridor and asked one of his friends in Nomura Bank how an actual bank works. Maybe they don't like him there. Maybe they close their doors on him. I don't know. Anyway, all very interesting. Bye.